My parents abandoned me at 14 with my grandma because of my health issues. Now they're begging me for the inheritance to save my brother. When I was a child, I was diagnosed with epilepsy at a fairly early age. It was a real challenge because my parents were emotionally and psychologically unprepared to deal with it. They started treating me like I was some kind of sick child they couldn't handle. I think I was around 6 years old when I first noticed they treated me and my brother very differently. My brother is 3 years older than me, and they always treated him much better than they treated me, probably because he was easier to deal with. But epilepsy wasn't the end of it. When I was 8, I was also diagnosed with dyslexia and a severe form of ADHD. Needless to say, this was a heavy burden for my parents, but it was their choice to have children, and they should have been ready for whatever came with that. I think they just assumed that since my brother was born perfectly healthy, I would be too. They never expected otherwise, and once I came along, they had no choice but to deal with me. They made that very clear, and it was awful. My childhood wasn't fun, or even normal, like most kids. Not just because of the medical issues, but because of my parents. Honestly, most of my problems stem from them, not from my conditions. The illnesses were only a part of it. Their reaction and attitude toward me were what truly crushed me. They always treated me like the outcast of the family. I never felt like I belonged, and they did everything to make sure I knew I was unwanted and a burden. Whenever I walked into a room, the conversation would immediately stop and everyone would go silent, like my presence ruined everything. I noticed this kind of behavior when I wasn't even 10 years old, and it only got worse with age. My mental health was fragile. I couldn't take how they treated me, and I started acting out during my teenage years. I think the hormones combined with a miserable childhood in a home where I was never wanted just broke me, and I rebelled. I stopped trying in school and started intentionally failing my classes because I was so angry at my parents for how they treated me. I became stubborn, disobedient, and outright rude to everyone. I pushed people away, even my friends. I knew deep down that my behavior wasn't right, but I was so unhappy that I didn't know any other way to get my parents' attention. Even then, they still didn't seem to care. Every time the school called my parents because I had broken the rules or misbehaved, they would just sigh in disappointment, but never actually scold me. That drove me crazy. I hated being around them. At home, I would throw tantrums, desperately trying to get their attention, but they completely ignored me and just continued talking to each other. They'd say I was making a scene again, roll their eyes, and tell me to behave myself. That was the most I could ever get out of them, and it broke my heart. When I turned 14, I broke a serious school rule. I decided to go completely off the rails. I brought a pack of cigarettes to school and started smoking right in the middle of class. When the teacher told me to stop and leave the room, I just flipped him off. That was the final straw. I had already been a frequent rule breaker, but I always managed to avoid real consequences because my parents kept telling everyone I was a special kid who needed to be treated with patience. But after that incident, there was no going back. I was expelled from school, and that was the one and only time my parents actually got angry with me. That day, they absolutely crushed me with their words, saying things I don't think I'll ever be able to forget or forgive. They didn't say anything I didn't already know deep down, but hearing it out loud was soul-shattering. They told me they regretted ever having me, and that if they'd known I would turn out to be such a messed up child, they would have terminated the pregnancy as soon as they found out about it. They called me a burden on the family and said things had been better when they only had one son. Now they were going to do everything to get rid of me so I would never bother them again. I was grounded for a week, and during that time, I was basically locked in my room. I was only allowed out to use the bathroom, and they brought food directly to my door. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere or speak to anyone, and I was completely miserable. It felt like solitary confinement, but worse because it was my own parents doing it to me. And I don't even think I committed some horrible crime. I was just acting out, and in my opinion, it was their fault. They never gave me the attention I wanted or needed. I was a child. They were supposed to be good parents. They were the ones who messed up. I could admit that I was difficult because of my medical issues, but they should have been more attentive. They should have thought carefully before deciding to have another child. Anyway, after that awful week, I finally found out what they meant when they said I would no longer be part of their family. One day, out of the blue, they told me to pack all my stuff and get in the car. While I sat there waiting, my mom and brother were inside the house packing up my belongings. About an hour later, everything was ready and we started driving. The road looked familiar, and within minutes I realized we were heading to my grandmother's house, my dad's mom. I figured maybe they just wanted me to stay with her for a few weeks to cool off. I knew my grandma was strict, but she'd always treated me better than my parents had. I didn't think it would be punishment, but once we arrived, I realized this wasn't a temporary thing. They were basically leaving me there for good so she could raise me, because they simply didn't want me anymore. That's what they had spent the entire week doing, convincing my grandmother to take me in. When we got to her house, my parents unloaded all my stuff and left it at the front door. They told me to take everything inside. Then they said this was my new home now, and that they didn't want any further contact with me, especially after everything I had done. According to them, I had gone out of my way to ruin their reputation, and now I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Standing at the door, I begged them not to do this because despite everything, I still wanted a relationship with my parents. I don't even know why. Maybe it was because I was just 14 and I still desperately wanted to feel like I belonged in my family. I knew that my grandmother loved me, but I wasn't sure if she really wanted to take me in. It felt like I was just becoming a burden for her, just like I had been for my parents. I didn't want to disappoint her because even in the past, when I visited and she found out about my behavior at home or at school, she would get very angry. But she always supported me, telling me that she knew I was strong. She tried to convince me that my parents would change if I started behaving better and believed in myself. That was another reason I didn't want to move in with my grandmother. I was afraid she might start hating me too, just like my parents did, and I couldn't bear to lose her as well. Everything felt so confusing, and I begged my parents to let me stay with them, but they said their decision was final. Right in front of me, they told my grandmother they were done and didn't even want to hear about me anymore. Then, they added that they didn't want a freak like me living with them because they wanted to focus on their perfectly normal son. And that really hit me hard, because those were the exact same words school bullies used to mock me. It was especially painful to hear them coming from my own parents. It's one thing when mean kids at school call you names. I got used to that and stopped taking it seriously. But when I heard it from my parents, I realized they were the biggest bullies in my life. In fact, they did me a huge favor by sending me to live with my grandmother because they would never have truly loved me no matter what I did. And I'm sure that even if I had behaved better, they still wouldn't have cared because to them, only my brother existed. So after that, I stopped begging and accepted that I would now live with my grandma. I decided that this was actually a good thing, something I deserved, and so did my grandmother. I wasn't going to ruin my life just because my parents didn't love me. After my parents left, my grandmother and I sat down to talk, and it was a conversation I really needed. She told me honestly that although she loved me, she hadn't been completely sure about taking me in, and she had serious doubts. She had heard from my dad about my behavior and said that at her age, it would be difficult to handle a troubled child like me. She understood that I needed help, but wasn't sure she could provide the right environment for me to grow. That's why it took her a week to make a decision. But after hearing from my dad that he had punished me by locking me in a room for an entire week while she was trying to decide what to do, she realized her son wasn't the kind of person who could raise me properly. She apologized for not stepping in sooner. She also had her own struggles. She was a widow and didn't have much money, so she had doubts about whether it was the right thing to take responsibility for me. But once she learned how badly I had been treated by my parents, she understood why I behaved the way I did. She said she wanted to give me the chance to do things right, something my parents never gave me. She told me I should see this as an opportunity, and that's exactly what I did. I apologized to her for everything I'd done in the past and told her I forgave her for not stepping in sooner, even though she knew how my parents treated me. We agreed to leave everything in the past and work together to create a better future for me. I've always been, and will always be, grateful to my grandmother for everything she did for me, because I truly believe I wouldn't be the person I am today if she hadn't been in my life and decided to take me in. From that day on, I completely turned my life around with her help.